Hello everyone, today we talk about Trebuchet once again, but about medieval engineering in general, as the Middle Ages could be defined quite properly as the civilization of the machines, right? We're used to think of, I don't know, 19th century England, but as the peak of this in our civilization, but really the relation between the curiosity, the intelligence, the entrepreneuriality also of man, and the actual application of technologies and experimentations, etc., belong to the Middle Ages, right? I want to make a lot of videos stressing this. Today we will not touch specifically the relation between medieval man and science, which is very deep and complex, but yet enormous as a topic more than else. And that's why we will discuss it on different occasions, because just in one it would be kind of crazy. But, recently we have addressed Trebuchet Warfare, siege warfare in the Middle Ages, and we have looked at it chiefly from, terms of performance, of technical data, range, precision, things like this essentially. But naturally the topic is much wider. I would like to deepen, especially one day when I have more time. Essentially, even where did exactly trebuchet come from? Because there is, I don't know how debated the theory is. I think we rely on a few elements, but this is a topic that, if investigated, in my opinion, can reveal a lot of interesting things. Definitely not expert about this, but that's exactly where I would like to research at one point. Because it seems to me that we stress too much the concept of kind of cultural mutuation, like the idea that, let's put it in this way, that one culture fundamentally imitates another, or gets taught by another, takes from another, or even steals from another. But I really don't reason in these terms most of the time. First of all, conceptually. But on the other hand, I think that given the general lack of evidence we have, especially for early medieval times in general, about warfare, that you can read, like there is archaeology, and there is then documentary, like chronicles often, and we really don't get much from this stuff. But objectively, we know, for example, from the 14th century, a lot of things about warfare. But it's not that we find an enormous amount of stuff, for example, from an archaeological point of view, so that we know actually a freaking lot about what a trebuchet was, even if we don't have maybe that specific one, that in that context. So you can easily understand how even the documentation can alter the perception of the spread or the use of certain weapons. We have seen this specifically. Today we will not talk about crossbows, but that's an analogous example, let's say, that can work in comparison, because we see that these technologies essentially appear in moments in which they're already fully developed, right? This is valid also for firearms in the late 13th, beginning of 14th century. Like, in order to have certain, not just the technology in itself, right, but also market of war that is able to produce that, and that is fairly and already actually widespread, especially in certain regions. Well, that's pretty interesting, and it shows that someone had been thinking at least a lot about not just, in fact, technology doesn't pop out because you discover it and all of a sudden you need to produce it to make exemplary stuff. No, there is a market. It's all about economy. If a technology is not viable, you can also know about that, but still you can't apply that because basically nobody would buy that. So everything naturally works very, very gradually. Also, the concept of military revolution is something we should completely, and I mean completely, get rid of. Like, I hate sometimes that it's dealt like, this thing is called like a military revolution, but if you really look at it, it took quite a while. Well, yes, it's much easier to say that there was no military revolution ever, right? And saying that, of course, that certain technologies changed a big deal over a very long time, accompanied by lots of other things that have not even strictly to do with military as such, and getting rid of this delusion of military revolutions, which I think every serious military historian shouldn't even conceive. But still, unfortunately, it is so. As always in my introductions, I have to be a bit more polemical. But this is not the point either. But in part, maybe yes. It's really about the idea of a this kind of passive absorption of technologies seems to me to make a great disservice towards the intelligence of humanity. Like, you can't think objectively that things like trebuchet or crossbow were things that were invented at one point or were imported at one point. Like, I can understand gunpowder because, yes, well, at a certain point, that came just with a certain level of awareness about certain characteristics. I mean, gunpowder has to be calibrated. As it was invented in China, it had also different characteristics from the way it evolved later on. It's absolutely false that the Chinese created gunpowder just for fireworks. They immediately used it for military purpose, right? The only difference is that it was quite a bit different, seems, at least as far as I know, but not expert about it, that actually the substances they used were combined in a way that with more sulfur essentially than saltpeter, so that it was more like an incendiary weapon, right? Even grenades were there. People say when were grenades first invented? As soon as there was gunpowder, like even before actually, because there were other ways of making a grenade, kind of a something could explode, at least break and get on fire. But wonder where first grenades shot for firearms as soon as firearms were invented. Like, so this shows you in many ways the prejudices we have in considering technological development. We need, as moderns, we are obsessed about the idea that something begins at one given point because someone has been given the prepared means to do that, and fundamentally you can't get out of that box. You can't see how this progressed on the base of certain specific needs, how sometimes there were already certain technologies that were capable of giving the same results, and that also contributed to effectively enhance and develop further instead this new means. But it's also thinking about the unknown that we generally don't, this obsession, once again, that is seemingly spreading, for which, if you don't have any direct evidence, you can't even theorize the existence of that something you're interested in. This is a great limit, because actually for certain times in history we know so few that you can't reason as if given the hints on the complexity of certain societies and political systems, that something wasn't there just because you don't have the evidence 1,000, 2,000 years later, right? It's an extremely selfish and delusional approach to history. So there is this prejudice that Middle Ages didn't have technological innovation, right? Especially in terms of military technologies. For many people, the Middle Ages is kind of rough caricature of sort of chiefly previous technologies, either previous technologies as a copy, right, and not as a continuity of something that humans simply use. There are people who literally think that the Middle Ages, needed to wait for the Renaissance for evolving technologically, while the Renaissance are actually the full accomplishment of medieval civilization in technological field. And it has nothing to do with reading manuscripts from the ancient world. I mean, literally nothing, because those were read exactly when in Europe, the military engineers, if we want to call them like this anachronistically a bit, had already theorized on their own and it just wanted to complement essentially their works based on an extensive amount of practical knowledge that we've lost track of because they didn't write it all down, right? So with the idea that they had needed to copy, it's completely wrong. At this time, I don't know any serious scholar who actually even believes that the Renaissance in Western Europe were triggered because all of a sudden, Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, and all these erudites with their books came, and all of a sudden the Western world came out of the Middle Ages. This is something I think they didn't believe. It was considered garbage already by the end of the 19th century, right? And there are people who still believe in this, in spite of extensive evidence and studies and acknowledgments and this side of the story. But that's where we stop. And the sad thing is that we are the Westerns. I mean, we are the guys who actually came out from there, and we can't understand this. We need to reason in terms of of our own obsession. It's extremely it hasn't probably nothing to do even with egocentrism. It's as if we were spoiled to think that every delusion we come up with, it's somewhat since it's our own, we have to follow it. Well, we've gotten past it. So at the popular level, we could, academically speaking, it's already so. At a popular level, we could also make a leap forward in this sense and get rid of this crazy stuff. For not talking about the Middle Ages as this concentrated of blind obscurantism. Many people objectively believe this. I mean, many people objectively believe that the Middle Ages had a kind of an intrinsic quality inferiority, sometimes even quantity, and that's even crazier than the ancient world, for example, or that there was something seriously wrong on there. So it is true, though, that it's only from the last generations that we have began to understand that, especially in the military field, I mean, given we're talking about the military field, that this is nonsense, of course. We have this greater attention and sensitivity to these extraordinary shades and effervescences of the Middle Ages, and we're discovering very late, too late, that corresponds to a bigger problem in our civilization before than the actual disinformation on the Middle Ages. This Middle Ages, as we were describing it before, as this extremely opulent in experimental vitality, creative imagination, that came to practice quite solidly, right? And passion for technology is developed exactly from the military art in the Middle Ages, and especially the mechanical technology proper, like and much earlier, in fact, than the celebrated progresses of the Renaissance, much before, right? Don't get tricked by this, right? The Renaissance people were working on the shoulders of the medieval people. Without them, there would have been no Renaissance, right? It's not because of the ancients, it's because of medieval civilization. In fact, the Renaissance, just for anybody who has any elementary notion of it, it's absolutely not an actual copy of ancient stuff. It's way more rich, it's way more advanced, right? So something in the middle had happened, and it's quite important to remember, right? And not even all the Renaissance people were, those kind of highly, let's say, classicist and minds that were obsessed by the copying of the past. There was, it's like the tip of the iceberg, right? And what is above water is really underwater is really the practicality of this world. Right, you can't think of the great geniuses of the Renaissance in science if you don't understand that they were coming from a substratum of enormous practical mechanical experimentation that didn't write, for example, largely, right? The treatises happened only, at a kind of a theoretical level, right? And this is, this is interesting. We should talk also about how there is even, like, it's not the Renaissance actually cut off with the Middle Ages in this regard as well. I mean, even Peter the Great of Russia, when he wanted to build his own galleys to fight against the Swedes in the Baltic Sea, what does he do? He goes to Amsterdam. He goes to the Netherlands, and he wants to know how to build ships, how to build vessels, and he effectively starts doing that. But the reason he soon discovers that the Dutch carpenters didn't have any book, they didn't have any treatise. They built hell of ships at that time. The Netherlands, United Provinces at the time were in the fullest of their prosperity, wealth, also military, say, balance in terms of cost profits. The Dutch army between the end of the 17th, the beginning of the 18th century is, in terms of ratio cost benefits, the strongest army in military history. Like, very few people know this, but if you really look at it, for that matter, this has nothing to do with the best in absolute terms. This is given a relative condition, right? So, but what I'm saying there is, for example, had Peter eventually gone on to Venice, where he wanted to go, but he had come back to Russia because of serious internal problems. Well, in Venice he would have found instead an enormous amount of treatises. And so you see even here how two areas of Europe that are quite developed at the time, they had sound maritime, naval engineering traditions, etc. They had, for example, a different way of looking at how to transmit knowledge, a reason for which you can't look, for example, at the early medieval times and stating with obvious certainty, well, something doesn't exist because we don't have the proof, because these were largely organic material, stuff that went, that perished essentially, and we do know, of course, that it wasn't a hidden, ultra-advanced civilization in the early Middle Ages that got mysteriously lost, but we also should be acquainted with the idea of a lot of continuity throughout all the early Middle Ages of things like, for example, Trojan engines. Hell, I mean, even the Vikings at the siege of Paris at the end of the 9th century had. These were definitely not some of the most technologically advanced peoples out there. They surely knew how to build ships. Those were hell of technological masterpieces, but, those were theoretical. Scandinavia was theoretically the area of Europe was the furthermost from technological advancements. They used it as well. So what does this mean actually? We have crossbows documented even in early medieval Scotland. That was also not definitely a pretty enormously developed technological place, just to put it mildly, and yet we find that. So concerning Trebuchet, we will talk better about this now, but we should in fact realize where these guys were coming from. I mean, why did actually there is this great development of siege warfare, especially in what we call the feudal age, right? I stress the adjective feudal here because it's important to realize the material dimension of the story as well. Like, many people say, oh, well, feudalism never existed, really. So, okay, well, yeah, but it's still a widespread and standardly used historiographical term. So if we talk about feudalism, it's like we talk about Byzantines. We don't need to be reminded every time what that actually means. Especially historians don't do that. So you could take their example. So feudalism, as we know, had brought basically to this enormous concentration of resources in the hands of an astonishing few amount of people. Right? This is feudalism in a nutshell. When you look at a feudal knight covered in iron, with an enormous training experience, a horse that costs an eye, and is like an unstoppable force on the battlefield. Well, at this time, you think And at this specific time, right, because we're talking really about the 12th and 13th century, so actually the centuries in which, paradoxically, in fact, even cavalry is unchallenged in Western Europe in open field. Like, this is different from the 11th century or from the 14th century. Actually, the predominion of heavy cavalry is that short. It's just like a couple of centuries, not even. But this had triggered, among the other things, this change of landscape with this enormous castles in stone, right? Let's say, military architecture previous centuries had surely contemplated areas, especially in southern Europe, where there was a greater continuity with ancient infrastructures, with stone stuff. But at this point, we're talking about fortresses of for the time, enormous size, really built in stone, right? Before it was basically all moat and bailey, right? This is mostly evident in those countries in which feudalism was more successful, like England and France, where the monarchies had objectively an enormous amount of resources they could concentrate in their own hands. So the thing is different in other areas of Europe, for example. You don't find all of this stuff, but definitely there is a general increase even in fortification in general, right? And the stone castle is the symbol and instrument of a territorial domination, right? And it poses this sound problem to military art of the time, because effectively these castles were pretty much effective, right? Let's say there is, it's difficult maybe to render this conceptually, but the idea is that everything that is there in terms of weapons, fortification, whatever thing military in that regard, it's because it works, right? If something disappears, it's because it doesn't work anymore. So whichever is out there, it's because it's functional, because it poses a real challenge to cope with military speed. So usually, in order to besiege a moat, you surely didn't need the complex and sophisticated and expensive torsion engines of the ancient world. You just stop there, you try to launch some assault, or maybe you simply stop there in order to starve the guys inside to surrender. Also, castles had in general a smaller strategic significance, right, before this time. At this point, the thing cannot go on like that. There is this great transformation that is exactly what I would like to deepen a little bit one day, that produce siege, let's say better, new siege weapons, right? And this is a properly medieval accomplishment, because here the medievals notoriously surpass ancient polyarcetics, right? Medieval siege warfare by the 13th century at the latest is already more advanced than the ancient one. It's self-evident, and the trebuchets are the proof of this, right? They naturally are two different contexts, so what is better or worse, once again, it's a relative term, but if you look just at the power of a trebuchet, as we will see later, there's no comparison with anything was put forward in ancient times. So the problem, though, so what was the real problem? Well, that in order to serve such fortifications to surrender, well, now you have to take into consideration the political and social picture, right? Medieval armies were mobilized just for seasonal times, right? Their encampments were often, they were large, they were difficult to maintain. I mean, it's not very healthy to remain that long on the same time with an army. Logistical trains were also kind of difficult. You can't ask for much from these economy, which is already based on agriculture, subsistence agriculture, right? So resources ran out pretty quickly, and that's why castles had grown to be so successful, right? So at this point, there is a properly technological answer that passed through, knowledge with the East, which surely came to be the case. I don't think that the Westerners kind of were well, this is also a bit should be reassessed, and well, okay, we don't have time to discuss this now, but let's say still there were definitely important exchanges, at least of knowledge, with the East, no doubt. There was a study of classical antiquity, no doubt either, right? But once again, think always that if this was happening, it was happening not because there was an external push, an external sting, right? Something that brought these people to, the encapsulation phenomenon, for example. It's a wholly internal European thing. Like you can't. Even the same second invasions actually were a secondary reason why Europeans began to build castles. This is renowned. Study Trebuchet, for example, study all those who have acknowledged that Europeans began to build castles for political and social reasons, internally speaking. They wanted to dominate their own lands. It wasn't really a defensive thing. Most castles that were built because of second invasions were destroyed eventually because there was no need for them anymore. And encapsulation began earlier than that, or at least in situations that predominantly weren't conditioned, as first major case, the overwhelming case, by external threat. This is all internal, and this helps you even to explain, in fact, why this transformation in Europe was so sound, and why even the contact with the East, albeit existing, because we do know that certain technologies did come from the East, should be, however, assessed on the basis of, but when did this, for example, happen? Because if we look at the Chinese trebuchet, well, we know that it was there when the Avars set foot in Europe in the 6th century. They brought them from actually not even I don't think even from China, because those were populations that were also in contact with other areas of the Middle East. Even later, the Hungars were actually pretty strongly in contact with Persian culture. We know there was a lot of exchange in that regard. But once again, the essence of what the trebuchet would become was already there, right? And it's not even like, it doesn't take a genius to know how to do that, right? The concept is that simple. It has success because it is simple. The Byzantines were definitely using those kind of machinery too, and it becomes kind of standard. And if you read early medieval sources, read Paul the Deacon, for example, well, we do know that these siege weapons were there, like the trebuchet. Aside from the, these early machines were activated by muscular force. A lot of people basically pulled the arm, let's say, down from the other opposite end from where it was loaded, and they dislodged. I mean, the same name of trebuchet comes from the Latin tria brachia, right? Because it means 3 arms, because seemingly, well, stereotypically, it was like 3 people pulling down these ropes from the other side, and making the arm, throwing this thing, rotating. And at the same thing, I mean, the next step of putting a counterweight balance to actually make it shoot for even hundreds of meters, with projectiles could arrive to hundreds of kilos, is not conceptually a problem, right? You don't have to think that that's the technological know-how that nobody had ever thought about that, and the medievals rediscovered or discovered these notions. No, it's that simple. Even a kid can build something like that. Have you never played with sticks and were little? I don't know, when you were at the beach, or you put stones, you make little catapults, right? Maybe I'm obsessed. Maybe I'm a maniac, and I'm dangerous, but I did this. There is nothing to understand here. What actually develops further this machinery is the availability of resources. What do you need to build a counterweight trebuchet that can launch a 100 kilos stone for 400 meters? Far beyond everything that has had ever been conceived in the ancient world. But obviously a castle, a stone castle, like the ones that start appearing in the 12th and 13th century. It's an economical question. It's not a technological question. Always. It's always like that. Technology is always secondary. Technology is always a consequence. It's not a cause, right? The share of cause of technology is just very small. Very, very small. First of all, it's economy. It's the practicality of the application of that technology. The technology in itself is very, very simple. So that's why we fall in those mistakes over and over. And at that point, you can't say, well, this stuff began to appear between the end of the 12th and the beginning of the 13th century in Europe, because, yeah, that's the counterweight, trebuchet, okay, but there were similar weapons like that since early medieval time, the very early medieval times in Europe. So what's the point? It's just like crossbows, right? Crossbows do the same exact thing. They've always been there. Crossbows existed since ancient Greece. They were used by in the late Roman Empire, widely in some ways, in some measure. We find them in 10th century France. Do you think that, I don't know, we find them in Scotland, as we've seen, in early medieval Scotland. Do you think that this stuff had been forgotten, had actually fallen out of use? It wasn't. It was already there. The problem was, do you need it? Is it effective? Is it convenient, economically? And that's the point. That's it. It's that simple. So, naturally, a much greater change would have been like, I'll think what is fascinating, I would actually attempt to address today, is this idea that this set of knowledges doesn't go, let's say, unaccompanied with other stuff. Like, technology and science at the time was thought in a very different way we do today. That was a world that definitely didn't have, they didn't know modern physics. They had they believe in spirits. They believe in nature that had to be deciphered in a kind of a almost exoteric way. That they believed, in fact, that there was no difference between science and magic, for example. Magic was science, and science was magic in many ways. Like, it was just a matter of defining what was acceptable, for example, for the church, and what was green light. But even in there, it was just because actually it seems that exactly the church was pretty much into magics. Like, the Church of Rome pioneered actually some of the greatest interests and researches in magic. All it took is says, okay, first comes God, first comes the world as we see it. Then think about even the integration of Aristotle. Aristotle was actually forbidden in the beginning by the church. Then we have scholastics. They integrated. Why? Because these people were simply beginning to study the stuff, building ever more complex systems, and actually applying the knowledge we're needing, and then also discovering that someone else in the past had already used, right? So they wanted to know more about it, to see whether they could sort something out better. But the majority of the work had already been done by them. But as soon as you said, okay, well, the church, the Bible comes first, but then let's also look at the stars for a confirmation. Well, that was fine, right? As long as you didn't say that, that overshadow like the biblical, the scriptures. You were fine, right? The Middle Ages, in this sense, were actually very open-minded. The myth of the oppression, as the idea of a scientific repression in these times is enormously debatable, because we have to understand what was that repression, first of all, and towards whom, and what was science at the time. But this is also another topic we have to address on another occasion, because it's very vast. Just to put it simply, there was much more scientific repression in the early modern age, especially by counter-reformism, than actually medieval times, right? On the contrary, the greatest promoters of scientific inquiry in the Middle Ages was actually the church proper. I mean, scholastics, literally. But the same happens in Islam. The same happens in Judaism, right? Think about Maimonides. Think about and they were pretty similar in this fashion. I mean, these were cultures were talking a lot to each other, right? There is an enormous commonality in this regard between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam in the scientific study at the time. So, as you know, well, I don't think we need to talk about how eventually, the differences with the ancient world in terms of siege engineering, etc. But here we have this enormous um improvement, as we were saying before, in the counterweight system. Now, the thing was very important because it was very precise. Like, the counterweight could weigh something like 30 tons. Therefore, it could shoot, as we were saying before, something like 100 kilos for 400 meters of distance. There were actually, and especially in the 14th century, I'm giving a look at now, specifically for other reasons, it could shoot at, we're talking about several hundreds kilos. That's impressive, right? It's a really disturbing thing, and obviously we don't even. I say this because sometimes we rely on chronicles, but we see, for example, there is a consistent increase, definitely in the dimensions, right? I made a video on the long sunset of Trebuchet Warfare that deals with that, so if you're interested in it, you can take a look at it. So the point of a counterweight, it offers, aside from just power, also kind of precision, because if you know how much that weighs, you can calibrate the shooting, right? You can know that adding more or less weight, you obtain that hit. This was very important because medieval castles were becoming ever more sophisticated and complex, and there were certain areas of them, certain structures of them that were weaker, right? Especially in proximity of the gates, it was easier to smash. So it was vital to be precise. It wasn't. There was actually this is not very often told, but there was a very big dynamism in terms of the relation between assault troops and siege artillery at the time, which we often start observing chiefly for firearms. But the same identical thing happened with trebuchets, with crossbows, right? So it isn't just the typical thing, as it was actually, of a siege that went on for months and months, and just these trebuchets keeping to launch projectiles. It was also when there was an assault to the fortifications, there was an actual support. So it was all very, very dynamic, and these weapons were often used, as also would be for later firearms, kind of a concert fashion, in support of the troops who were advancing. Today we don't talk about crossbows specifically, but the same identical thing. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. Because, by the way, torsion engines had not been lost completely. Actually, they were always there. Medieval siege warfare sees the employment of ballistas, right, that are actually very, very useful in many situations, even in urban warfare, among the narrow, within the narrow city streets of medieval towns, especially they were deployed in the squares, right? The areas were effectively that were needed to be controlled to dominate the city, etc. So shooting at the mouth, let's say, of the squares where all the various ways arrived. And there is not much of a difference even in here between, as in early firearms, between what we could define artillery and firearm. Right, they were conceptually the same thing. There were crossbows that could be as big as, there was no categorization, first of all, right? So for example, there was the idea of a diminutive. For example, the large crossbow and a small crossbow. What they meant, even though there is no actual scientific categorization, which we invented with the Enlightenment, is that there were engines in the sense of all sizes, right? Just like the early firearms, right? The musk and vice versa. But for example, muskets originally were actually small artillery. They weren't firearms. And there were there were all types. There was no standardization, of course, even though for especially crossbows, I imagine that there was a pretty, given their intensive use and also widespread use, especially in certain areas of Europe. Basically, the bow is completely substituted by the crossbow, and also the myth that the bow in itself or the longbow is intrinsically superior to the crossbow is actually a myth, right? And has nothing to do with the 100 Years' War as such. It is literally a matter of doctrine, how you employ that, once again, and it's not, once again, the technology that objectively makes the difference, even though, speaking of longbow, that was a hell of a weapon, right? Even, it had dramatic performance, was terrific, but still, it's not alone that, there are other factors that brings to this change. Hence, there was no idiot who kept fighting with the thing that didn't work, and the others were more clever, and they defeated them. It's not so, right? Even don't make the silly mistake of reading the 100 Years' War as just, this bunch of arrogant French drunkards that simply threw themselves to, against the English to be butchered down, right? Study von Clausewitz, study the fog of war, look at what medieval battles effectively were from the sources, and don't give this mechanicistic and positivistic explanations to things that we don't even know in the first place. So, and you have to think of the spin-off of this all. For example, if you go the stone cutters, we made a video some month ago, I think it was about, in fact, medieval military engineers, right? As I was saying before, it's a bit of an anachronistic term because there is no real military engineering proper, right? It could be in the modern age conceptually as a subject, but de facto that's what we're talking about in employment. All the people who worked for this, we have observed in those videos, for example, how even the military administration of certain powers was very, very imposing. Now, the Kingdom of England, in this sense, was extremely disciplined. It had, a branch of royal administration dedicated to the preparation, especially of projectiles that were all polished, they were spherical. We know during the Albigensian Crusades that, for example, the French Crusaders still kind of took the stones from, along the way, they cut them there, right? This has to do not much with the technology in itself, once again, but with the political and social cohesion of certain groups, right, that is eventually transferred in the military field. Certain scholars actually hypothesized that the experiences matured in the studying of the counterweights and the force of gravity for the realization of trebuchets actually favored the invention of clocks that, in fact, were being developed substantially at that time through the same technology, essentially. Technology in itself has also an impact in how politics and society evolves, definitely, right? It's minority, as we were saying before, but, for example, we think the Trebuchet Warfare was more or less in the same relation to national monarchies in the low Middle Ages, that gunpowder artillery had in the development of the early modern state, right? There was a need of centralization for, creating larger military infrastructure at this point, and smaller seigneuries couldn't do that anymore. You needed something more centralized. Also, we have very good documentation about these developments. There are many manuscripts, illuminations that show us all these machinery, but especially what I find interesting is the role that men have in it. Like these manuscripts are not merely abstract kind of just interested in the instrument as such, as it happens in modern theorization. No, pictures of these engines are often populated by people, right? That use them, that live in them. It really reflects the medieval mindset in which knowledge and let's say in humanity are solidly intertwined, but because it's a Christian duty to investigate creation as such. That's a religious duty, right? There's a full complementarity between faith and science that pushes, in fact, scientific innovation further. So this true and proper passion for machines gives rise to generations of proto-engineers that would pave eventually the road to the greatest of all. At the end of the Middle Ages, we think at the Renaissance now, but Leonardo da Vinci was essentially a continuator of this tradition. Very important, right? Middle Ages produced this. The Renaissance is a product of the Middle Ages. So we can definitely talk about the Middle Ages as the civilizations of machines, of intellectually curious people who were capable of, experiment in every field of inquiry, right, and putting together transversally lots of knowledge with abilities that today we could recognize as hypertextual, for example. And so it's the true passion for of the medieval man was for mechanics, right? This idea of transforming, this of creating a pneuma, something that really could solve all the problems. That we're talking about precise characters, right? Aside from the plethora of individuals we've lost track of, but we're talking of genuinely medieval engineers when we talk about, for example, Guido da Vigevano, Walter de Millemate, Mariano di Jacopo, Giovanni Fontana, Conrad Chiesa. These were all engineers, but also scientists, as they were conceived at the time. They were interested in technology, in magic, and they saw all science in this sense as this divine gift that was enthusiastically tending towards the bettering of the living condition and the life of man, right? So to address this topic means to realize that we can't make the mistake of thinking relatively to such improvements to merely technical facts, right? In reality, behind them there was a very serious technological meditation. In this regard, it's important to stress naturally also the relation between medieval military engineers and ancient historiography. Vegetius and other military treatises that had never been really forgotten, right? This other story that the Middle Ages had forgotten the ancient knowledge as a whole. This is false, right? We've seen before how objectively much of that knowledge was of no use or little practical use in certain contexts, especially in early medieval times. But the realization that this past had left a serious inquiry that, Vegetius was read as, look at 9th century Friuli, which is not a particularly advanced, let's say, urbanized, etc. area, but, it was read by counts, by Carolingian counts, by people who made war, who also were rarely literate, and yet there was who appreciated these things because they thought, we know there is an enormous historiography regarding this, we have this dramatic problem that we don't know which is, for a long time actually, before the Renaissance, which was the actual relation between military thinking and ancient, and Vegetzius specifically, because we're talking essentially about him in terms of Western awareness of what military theory had been in the past. But it's here that we have to realize why such texts came back to circulate intensely from the 12th century, right? And they even produced this abbreviations and vernacularizations, we say so, this compendia of that had to carve out the juice of all of this wisdom. That, however, shouldn't be thought as, Vegetzius actually wrote something back in the day, 4th century, we now must take this to know how to make war. Absolutely not. Right, there was never a time, leaving aside that the same Vegetzius admits by his own, explicit statement that he was not an expert in military affairs, right? He knew most, and that he made definitely, like his work is more praising towards the ancient, the old classical times, like you have the early empire, late republic, when Rome was still a thing, right? Not like in the 4th century. It actually was the other way around, because Vegetzius, in fact, was not an expert, obviously, even in the military of the time, which was dramatically advanced, definitely. And they had, the Roman army in the 4th century was actually even superior to, tactically speaking, to the one of the Principate. But the point here is realizing, and we don't know that, but at least how these texts were used by the medievals. Like what is they thought of reading? Like, of course they tried. We know that their culture in this sense was quite notionistic. Like they were trying to take inspiration mostly from certain quotes, certain statements, certain ideas, right? Never forget that in certain, especially towards the 14th century, there is also something in the West that comes from marginally, even from the ancient Byzantine treatises, and we're not talking specifically of this treatise proper, but actually of Byzantines who also interacted, especially with Southern Europe, to formulate their own treatises on the base they had actually collected in Western Europe. Look at Theodore of Montferrat, who was a Palaiologos, and who wrote back in Greece his military treatises, but he had been fighting consistently in northern Italy, where he had come to claim his inheritance. So we can see from there that actually in such treatises there was a pretty good understanding of what current military art really was, but at the same time was a continuation, and that is kind of an exception, but with the literary models of the Byzantine treatise tradition, let's say, that was quite specific, quite kind of self-imitating, but at the same time, it's a florid encounter. It's not a passive one. It's not a disconnected one. And we know, by the way, in these centuries, siege warfare is expanding like crazy, even in military engineering. Now, we can look at Roman engineering saying, wow, this is great, right? Yeah, the Romans could build camps so orderly and so effectively and so great. Have you ever read, I don't know, what was a medieval camp fortification in siege warfare during the 13th, the 14th century? You still think of Alesia in the Gallic Wars. Look at what was happening in certain during the 100 Years' War, where the Italian signories, those were freaking impressive stuff, right? And the interesting thing is that the same authors of the time recognized this, Alright, there are certain chronicles that say, if you read the commentaries of Caesar, you find this fortification at Alesia, for example. But this thing we did here was larger, and he wasn't boasting that. He was actually describing how large that was, with measures and actual idea of how big that and how many ditches, how many palisades and castles and things were built around the besieged city of thing like that. We deeply overlooked this. I mean, to us, military engineering is the Romans, right? Have you ever given a look at the Middle Ages, what it actually was? Okay, we're talking about the 14th century. We're not talking about the 7th. Okay, I give you that. But why would you think necessarily that for one description in the ancient world, well, that ancient world had to be all in block, substantially advanced in the Middle Ages as such? I mean, I know many of you probably don't do this because you're clever and you don't get fooled, but I don't see this great awareness around me wherever I go, right? And I think the people who make disclosure on the internet, etc., tend to ride the wave of this ignorance because everybody knows, in fact, about Caesar at Alesia. But how many people do know about 14th century Europe in the actual practice of warfare? I mean, not just the highly abstract, tactical, speculations that have so much, appeal among non-educated on certain matters. But let's say the awareness that this military engineering was as and actually more advanced, like in one of the ancient world. Literally, you don't hear it much around. And I suspect that there is a lot of ideologism behind it, and I still don't understand what is fueled by, though. Like, it's as if we had to think as moderns that, I don't know, there was just one point of reference that was a moment of backwardness and an improvement, like, but wouldn't it be better if you really like, I don't know, your past, let's put it in this way, that to acknowledge that there was a consistent continuity in these matters for a very long time. I don't know, these are just my personal reflections, but I think there is some evidence to sustain them looking around ourselves. And by the way, the fact that these texts were translated, even in vernacular, they were synthesized, it means they circulated. This is the other enormous myth, that in the Middle Ages just the scholars, the priests studied. Once again, have you seen what was on average 14th century Europe? Or already the 13th century? You know how many people could read at the time? How many were actually literate? How many were made an actual living about studying this stuff and putting it to practice? That's another thing you don't hear very much. Yet it existed, and these people weren't elite. We know that. Take a look at that video I made really on medieval engineers, medieval military engineers. That tells you those people came from the lower classes. They were even knighted eventually because of the value they had. We were talking about 12th century, 13th century. Those were the centuries of the great translations from Greek, from Arabic, but also of autochthonous, indigenous Western European independent production that is massive and that seems to have revolved, and this is the interesting thing, exactly around the military improvements, the military advancements. Because war was really a part of the normal political and social dialectic. Like these guys, it was all about war fundamentally. A large part of their activity, like large part of their surplus, was destined to that. And it also makes sense. It's not because they were evil or bloodthirsty. It's because literally there wasn't many other investments that you could secure, but waging war, because that was the only way to keep safe and to kind of keeping afloat, remaining afloat in a storm of political instability, of invasions, of other disasters. Like, you must seize a lot immediately, otherwise you could run short of resources eventually. This is the great problem, specifically of those centuries there, right? And there is not to be surprised in this regard that the major innovation came at that point, because exactly in order to surpass these limits, there were pretty hard limits, right? If you screw up a campaign, you may not have the time to recover that. I mean, it takes maybe 2 generations to put up an expedition like that once again for certain local principalities, seigneuries. Resources are extremely rare. So 12th century, great century, must be understood better. Because in parallel to this improvement, there was actually an increase of instability in some form. Like, means became more destructive, so wars were more, epidemics more. I mean, the systemic failures of the system were increasing. Hence, you needed more security. Hence, you need sounder investments. Hence, you have to invest in those means that provide you with such assets. Let's put it in this way. And this stuff was costly. Don't think you simply, okay, well, you undertake a siege because you're just bored. This stuff costed an astonishing amount of money, especially sieges, right? Because but okay, we should expand on a lot of aspects of strategy that have strictly actually to do with siege warfare in here, but it's not quite today's topic. So there is a great improvement here I would like to stress from the ancient world, because much of the machinery also non-military meant built in the ancient world, which included steam engine, as you know, a lot of stuff, right, that was really impressive, are often misunderstood. Like, people see that as the preludium to an industrial revolution. I mean, people were serious about believing that, and they are obviously wrong under any standard, that, I don't know, if Rome had not conquered the Hellenistic kingdoms or city-states, we would have had an industrial revolution, like with trains, locomotives, all this stuff. We would have got into the Americas before. No. This is not the case, and this is not understanding technology contextualized in the socio-economical background of the time. There were no resources to build infrastructures like those and making the system survive. They didn't make it. It was not about slavery, right? It was not cultural. This is another thing they try to explain, that, no, it's the mindset, because I have slaves, hence I don't need to improve in other ways. First of all, at the time, everybody had slaves, which is if the entire world practices slavery and doesn't invent something else, because even Hellenistic powers used slavery extensively, just as the Romans did, for example, there is something there that you have to realize. Secondly, in fact, part of this stands into, what these technological achievements that were real. Don't get me wrong, the technology was there. Once again, it's the application of it, which is wholly another matter. For example, how do you think steam engines actually work? How we can make a locomotive work? Do you think that in the 2nd century BC they had all the componentistic that was needed to actually create, to contain steam pressure in order to make a locomotive move? That's something that they could have in 18th century England. During colonialism, during a lot of that level of mercantilism, of the expansion of European economy in a way that these guys were not even dreaming of, right? So That's another thing. But another thing that is important to understand at that time, that the technological inventions were part of essentially divertissement of that culture. We talk about the Alexandrine Ludwig mechanism, right? This idea that these great Hellenistic sovereigns paid scholars to essentially invent these little machines just to please them, to show off, to say, oh look, we made this gates opening with steam pressure by themselves, made this clock, this water clock, we made that's what they remained like 95% of scientific research at the time was actually philological inquiry, wasn't actual applied physics with a broader, massive understanding of how this could be applied for the need of pushing society forward. There was no need to push society forward because the resources were already limited the way they were, and the way the society was organized at the time was already fit to make things work better. This is not to say that in Hellenistic times we did not have actual applications of technology. Think about the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean were connected. Think about all the dams in channels in Ptolemaic Egypt, or later on, even the Roman era did that. For example, with in Greece, there was this application, but it was the one which was done was evidently bent to concrete problems that at the time they finally had resources to invest and to solve, but not to solve with technology as we think as this. Technology was very advanced for those time standards in this regard. I mean, that's the best they could do. But these great inventions of the past that the medievals should have learned from were things that they actually already knew by themselves in the Middle Ages without anyone teaching them from the past. I mean, if you take, for example, water mills, windmills, fulling mills, well, these were things that existed since ancient Mesopotamia. But it's not that people had needed the treatise to know how they work. Those things had always been there. The reason why they get revived in some extensive way during the Middle Ages is because finally societies has enough resources to diversify, to invest in other areas, and to improve the stuff that, I mean, it's sheer logic. And it had always remained there in a minimal part. The same goes for siege warfare in this regard. And what is interesting, going back to the idea of the church as actually supportive of technology in general at the time, was this famous praising that the same Bernard of Clairvaux, about whom we made a couple of videos already, so you can go check that. And that, as we have seen, was definitely not a person who was easily fascinated by the novitates, as they were known at the time. Actually, he's very positive and very supportive of this, and willing to accept all of these new technologies, these new machineries that were introduced within the monastery perimeters, right? So where he had criticized the presence of, let's say, inopportune distractions, let's put it in this way, for the monks, he accepts the fulling mills, the grinding machines for floor, those machines for tanning leather, watering vegetable gardens, to wash, and therefore, and which was definitely an enormous confidence and an enormous trust in the positivity of technologies that were pretty modern for the time, because these were, in fact, innovations of the time, were spreading, and that were seen as positive at the fullest of the Christian scientific framing of the world. I mean, these things were useful for people. there weren't distractions, there weren't terrible means of the devil. No, these technologies were actually super cool, and they wanted to have them, and they were perfectly fine with that. But just to say one thing that you say with the medieval civilization, Gothic cathedrals. Do you realize what in the history of civilization, on a linear scale, the Gothic cathedral is? Let's maybe not discuss it now, because otherwise we'd never stop, but just looking at them, I think it's pretty eloquent. Who had ever done anything like that? And that among all the other monuments, Gothic cathedrals are a hymn per excellence to building machinery. And the knowledge, and anybody who knows Gothic cathedral has a pretty clear, is pretty aware of the, aside from the sheer technical complexity of the architecture, but of the presence of a hidden meaning between those same architectural proportions that made the structure what they are, right? This is not just knowing how to achieve something. It's literally designing something you already have projected with your mind, and that passes through the studying of an enormous set of things, including music. Do you think that normally people think that Vitruvius, as the manual of architecture per excellence of the ancient world, was the thing that actually had Gothic cathedrals built, right? The single most important text that made us having the Gothic cathedrals as they are is St. Augustine's De Musica. Cathedrals are based structurally on musical harmonies. That's what they are. So it's not the rough, as moderns we have completely cancelled the idea that there is a superior knowledge, that we have to make an effort, because the modern mind is, okay, let's find a machine that makes the job for us, and then let's simply do other stuff without applicating our mind anymore. These people knew how to applicate their minds. That's also why we know so few, because these guys could store in their minds an enormous amount of knowledge, and most of us wouldn't be able, as fully grown old, without that type of education, able to replicate. These people didn't just know how to build a cathedral. These people knew philosophy. They knew astronomy. They knew music. They were polymaths. True, these people had nothing to envy in this conceptual regard to the great humanist polymaths of the 15th to 16th century. Gothic cathedrals are a miracle of beauty. This is the greatness of our civilization. And so even when you look at a weapon, you say, well, this is what you need to essentially to crush people and to slaughter them and to make them crumble with old walls and towers over them, right? But the same principles of the leverage and the counterweight were adapted equally well to contribute to the elevation, for example, of the wall of a church, or in fact, conversely, to the crashing of a castle wall, right? They were the same thing. They were simply a different phase of a system of civilization. Always remember this, that from war, in its dramaticity, we had sometimes the annihilation of civilizations. From the other side, we had the dramatic improvement of it. Look at medicine, look at communications. But all type of technology is massively boosted by war. This is what everybody knows in history of economics or of science. The greatest leaps forward in human civilization often coincide not with periods of florid growth, but actually because that was triggered by something before, but often by crisis, and very often by war in this regard. Normally, societies that work fairly well do not feel the need to better themselves very much. It's only when there is a real problem that you need to apply your mind to make it work, right? And to find concrete solutions. This is a great difference between, in fact, even in the Renaissance, what is that you find is that there is a detachment between, of the most elevated intellectual thinking with the practicality of it. This is very evident. Think about medicine. I mean, a doctor in the modern age didn't even have to touch a patient. Because who does touch a patient? I'm a doctor. I don't have to touch a patient. That was the thinking, really. And most of things were, this was done, for example, by the midwives, by barbers, by these that very often had a much sounder practical notion of what actual medicine is, right? Why? Because with the Renaissance there is a social certification, there is a detachment of the most intellectualized, aestheticized, abstracted thinking, but the disconnection with the practice. The Middle Ages do not have this. And this is what you can find in medieval literature as well. The greatest geniuses of medieval literature that are the true pillars of Western civilization were people who could talk about theology, of the skies, of physics, as they could use vulgar slang and dirty particular talk about obscenities and stuff, because that is the full intelligence. That is the idea of you can cover everything with your mind. And we are truly sons of the Middle Ages in this regard, because this is what we should seek to do, and we're partly managing to do. We're recognizing that we need to recover largely this possibly, at this point, omnicomprehensible knowledge is impossible, but definitely a set of notions that stays fluid in the interaction of all the various subjects, right? You can't study history if you don't know mathematics. I mean, seriously, you want to study history because you don't want to study mathematics. Do not go to university, please. Do not do it. We don't need you. Nobody needs you. Do something else. Okay? Maybe study mathematics for real at that point. You will understand. You will start to like history and mathematics alike, because that's the point of the story. We are surrendering our mental faculties to technology, and that's why we're so passive and so misled in judging the past at the same time. The work of man is a work of mind. Strength comes later. It's a step later. It's needed. It's equal. It's needed, but it's still subordinated to the mind. And until we fail to, as long as we fail to understand this, we're lost, I think, as a civilization. We cannot understand. That's why it's important to study the Middle Ages, because the Middle Ages show you the whole picture in one shot. That's the thing of the Middle Ages that you rarely find elsewhere, right? Because other historical epochs had different standards, had different voices, had different parameters. The Middle Ages were trying to sort things out, and they were the guys who founded the basis of the subsequent accomplishments, without which would have not been the civilization in which we live here. And it was not starting from zero, but it was not even needing to start from a point, because these guys were living in their world and they made it function pretty damn well, contrarily to all the various prejudices that we have still, and disgustingly and obscenely and incredibly towards the Middle Ages as a dark period. Alright, this was just a reflection, as you understand, on the broader meaning of not just of military innovation and military engineering and machinery, siege warfare in medieval times, but also on the, in fact, the really the complementary, like the essential role that war has in civilization. Like, there can't be a civilization, a moral civilization, a successful civilization, that does not realize the effort, the application, the rationality that exists in the military effort as such. And this is what we try to explain with von Clausewitz series, but it passes through this historical realizations, also for von Clausewitz himself. Alright, so for today I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.